All right, in lesson two, we're going to talk about how African Americans were treated during the Reconstruction period. And what you have to recall about how African Americans were treated was that at the end of the war, the Southern economy was ruined, and there were no farms for them to work, no plantations. So essentially, you have a lot of people who are out of work, and even if those farms hadn't been destroyed, we really wouldn't know, or the Southerners really didn't know what to do with now all of these freed slaves. We can't force them back into slavery. We don't have the economy capable of paying many people to work. And even if we did, we don't have anywhere for them to work. We couldn't, it was questionable as to whether we could make them go back to their old jobs. Of course, we couldn't make them since they were freed, but what do we do with them then? And so one of the initial efforts to try and help these freed slaves was to set up what was known as the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was a group created by Congress in 1865 that was led by General Oliver O. Howard, who went on to found Howard University. This organization was set up to help these now freed slaves until something more permanent could be found. And so the Freedmen's Bureau provided food and clothing and shelter for these freed slaves until we could figure out what was actually going to happen with them. One of the traditions that had been set up by the Union Army as they moved through the South was to distribute the plantation lands to the slaves who used to work the land. And the rule that General Sherman's army and General Grant's army used was to give each slave their own 40 acres. The Freedmen's Bureau was set up giving what was known as 40 acres and a mule. The mule was there to help work the small farm that the freed slave would hopefully be able to set up. The Southerners react very angry to this because they're taking their plantation, the North is taking the Southerners' plantation lands and dividing them up and just giving them away. They had confiscated these lands and had just taken them and given them away. And so that's one thing that's going to make the Southerners very angry. The second thing is that these Southern plantation owners were taught since birth that they were better than their slaves. And now here comes the government to tell them that no, you are not better than your slaves. Those slaves are now freed, and you are going to have to work with them on this land that used to be yours. And so it's the government stepping in and trying to define how people should treat each other, when the Southerners had been taught since birth that they were superior. And so they resented this as well. Now, in order to get this to work, he couldn't find many Southerners, although there were some, and we'll talk about those in a bit. There were some Southerners who were willing to work with the North, but most of the work that's going to be done in the South during this time is going to be done by Northerners moving to the South in order to enact these government programs. And those Northerners who moved to the South were mostly Republican, they were mostly white, and they were known as carpetbaggers. They were named after the type of suitcase that they carried. You would take a piece of carpet and you would fold it up into a bag, sew it together, put a handle on it, and there you go. You could carry quite a few possessions in there. And so these carpetbaggers were Northerners who moved south in order to help promote these programs. There was a lot of violence against both the former slaves and the carpetbaggers who came down. As your notes talk about, in the summer and fall of 1868 in Louisiana alone, about 1,000 carpetbaggers and former slaves were killed during that summer. And so anyone who was helping these former slaves were running the risk of being murdered or being persecuted themselves. What the Southern governments end up doing is they want to try and keep Southern relations as close to pre-Civil War actions as possible. And so in order to do this, what they did was they passed a series of laws known as Black Codes. And those Black Codes were meant to help the economy, but they really didn't. Those Black Codes were actually meant to maintain the current status of race relations. These black codes are going to be different than Jim Crow laws, which we're going to study in a future chapter. But the black codes were to stabilize families. And so they would pass black codes saying that blacks couldn't marry whites. They were meant to promote working conditions, and they didn't want slaves just being lazy and not doing anything, which was the stereotype at the time. And so they prevented whites from loaning money to slaves. They didn't want slaves attacking their former masters, and so they wanted to maintain peacefulness in the South, and so they outlawed the sale of guns to blacks. And so this attempt at setting up these black codes in governments which were controlled by the Republicans didn't last very long, if they were controlled by the carpetbaggers. But once states begin to revert to control back to Democrats and back to Southerners who actually lived there, these black codes are going to be put into force, and the federal government is going to be too busy with other matters to try and prevent this discrimination. And so what you end up seeing is that these freed slaves are not put back onto the plantations by force, but they're put back onto the plantations by necessity. If they cannot take out loans in order to pay for the equipment that they need to work their 40 acres, then those 40 acres are going to be sold back to the former plantation owners, and those former slaves are going to be back working for them for very low pay. And so the Northerners are very angry that this kind of discrimination was going on, but in the very near future, we're going to be distracted by a lot of different issues, and the Northerners are not going to make that many overt efforts to help them maintain or promote equality for about 100 years. And so we will now move on to lesson 3.